Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is the Takeout. We're going to talk about Jimmy Carter this episode. President of the United States, as you well know, recently passed. And there's no really better person we could talk to about this topic than Jonathan Alter. His book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Outstanding book about Jimmy Carter. Jonathan Alter, great to see you.
Great to see you, Major.
What should people who don't know very much about Jimmy Carter, the president, think about now?
I think they should try to understand that he was one of the most underrated presidents in American history. And that doesn't mean he belongs on Mount Rushmore. Mm-hmm. He's not in the first rank of American presidents. But he got a lot more accomplished than people recognize. And many of those accomplishments shape our world today.
I'm glad you said that, because in the immediate aftermath, there's all this talk about him having a very successful post-presidency, as if he didn't have a successful presidency. Now, one reason for that is one-term presidents are regarded as less successful than two-term presidents. But you can still have an impactful, memorable, and historic one-term. There are several examples of that, but tell my listeners and viewers why Jimmy Carter deserves that kind of description.
Well, when people say that two-term presidents are the only ones who, deserve respect, they're judging the presidency politically, by how the president did politically. And by those terms, Jimmy Carter was a failure. But I view him overall as a political failure, but a substantive and often visionary success. So, you and I are both journalists, and when you have your journalist hat on, you judge him by the fact that he got shellacked by Ronald Reagan in 1980. It wasn't a close election. But when you put on a historian's hat, you need to look at these presidents by how they changed the country and the world. And by that standard, he measures up quite well.
Explain. What do we live with now, and what did happen then that we should look back and say, that's distinctly Carter and therefore valuable?
Well, let's just start with foreign policy. There are a lot of domestic achievements, too. 15 major pieces of environmental legislation, the first president ever to embrace alternative energy, and a lot of other things on the domestic side. But let's just talk about foreign policy. I think people tend to remember the Iran hostage crisis. And even though all the hostages came home safely, which, as we know from what's going on in Gaza, is no minor thing if you can get all your hostages back in one piece, despite that, he's kind of remembered as a failure on that because he kind of let himself be held hostage by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and it contributed to his defeat in 1980. So let's just set Iran aside for a bit. That's clearly not a big success. The Iran hostage rescue mission failed. Let's look at the other parts of his foreign policy. And the one that I think has had the longest lasting legacy is his human rights policy, which at the time he developed it was a little bit hypocritical, because amid the Cold War it was a little bit selectively applied. But as the Harvard historian Carl Deutsch said to Jimmy Carter not long after he left the presidency, and he ran into him, and Carter was amid a kind of a depression, having lost. Carl Deutsch said to him, President Carter, 1,000 years from now, there will be very few American presidents who will be remembered, but you will be because of human rights. So that human rights policy, which was essentially globalizing the civil rights movement in the United States, it set a standard for how countries should treat their own people. And we're worried now, with good reason, about advances that authoritarian figures have made in recent years. But there are many more democracies in the world now than there were in the 1970s. So just to take Latin America very quickly, when Carter was president, every nation in Latin America, in South America, was authoritarian except for Venezuela.
Right.
And now every nation is a democracy except for Venezuela.
Right.
And we could talk at length, I won't, about the advances in Asia, in promoting Asian democracy. Some of it took some years before it unfolded.
Right.
It didn't happen right away. But human rights policy, as Václav Havel and others said, was very, very important in ending communism, too. So I'll move on in the interest of time. Normalizing relations with China, which is what Jimmy Carter told me he believed would be his longest-lasting legacy. So Richard Nixon opened the door.
Right.
Carter walked through it with Deng Xiaoping. The week that Deng Xiaoping returned from Washington to China in 1979, the first thing he did was legalize private property. And China went on to experience the fastest, greatest growth in human history in its economy. Would have been simply impossible without normalized relations with the United States. The bilateral relationship between these two countries, for all its problems, is the foundation of today's global economy. That was an accomplishment of Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. Camp
David, right.
Camp David. So imagine if today Israel and Egypt were enemies and on the verge of fighting a war. Imagine that on top of everything else that's happened recently in the Middle East. So Israel and Egypt fought 4 wars after Israeli independence in 1948. And then Jimmy Carter made peace between them, which is the most durable peace treaty of the post-war era. So that's a huge accomplishment. Now, Carter told me he was disappointed that he didn't get a path to a two-state solution, to a Palestinian state, which he believes he would have been able to accomplish in his second term. And it was his single greatest disappointment about not being reelected. But it's an immense achievement, and one that wouldn't have happened, as both Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin said on many occasions, without Jimmy Carter. And I'm just getting started very quickly.
Right.
The Panama Canal treaties, which when I started doing research on the book, I said, how interesting is that, right? But remember, the canal is a major artery of global commerce. And earlier presidents didn't have the political guts to pursue this as an issue, in part because Ronald Reagan was using it to fuel his rise in politics, and it was very harmful politically. Carter
a conservative
tackled it.
populist, we built it, it's ours. We'll decide
Right.
under what terms
Exactly.
it will be used.
So, and Gerald Ford almost lost the nomination in 1976 to Reagan on that issue.
Yep.
So everybody told Carter, including his own wife, deal with this in a second term. Carter said, no, I've got to tackle this. It was politically very damaging for him. It was extremely difficult to get through the Senate. They needed 2/3 approval on an issue that 2/3 of the public was against, if you can imagine that. So this was a huge bipartisan achievement, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified that it prevented an ongoing guerrilla war in Panama. We would probably still have American troops, 100,000 the chiefs thought we needed, to protect that canal if those treaties weren't approved and we didn't turn the canal back over to the Panamanians.
That is the voice of Jonathan Alter, as he said, and I will reiterate, we are just getting started. Our thanks to the Lambs Club here in downtown Midtown Manhattan. Our conversation, segment 2 of the Takeout with Jonathan Alter about Jimmy Carter, will continue in just 1 second.
After that debate and after a failed final effort to negotiate the release of the hostages, the roof caved in on Carter.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Jonathan Alter is our special guest. We're talking about former President Jimmy Carter because Jonathan Alter, I think fair to say, the definitive book about Jimmy Carter, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. So you talked about the foreign policy achievements. And yet, the popular history, the quick take, the hot take, if you will, on the Jimmy Carter presidency was that he was overwhelmed by the office. He was naive about foreign policy and international relations, and that had it not been for Reagan and the strength and the ferocity to fight the Cold War, America might not have ever won that. Try to help my audience reconcile that hot take with what you just described.
Yeah, I mean, that's an argument that the neoconservatives made. I do think there's a sense in which he was swamped by events. He was overwhelmed by events, and he lost his connection to the American people. And he also had a terrible economy, which we can talk about. But these were mostly external events. They were not caused by Jimmy Carter. And why did Reagan succeed? Why was he reelected so easily in 1984? Because ruinous inflation, double-digit inflation, was tamed. Who did that? Ronald Reagan? No, it was done by a gentleman named Paul Volcker, who was
Chairman of the Fed.
Who appointed Paul Volcker, even knowing that his harsh medicine would probably not save his presidency? Jimmy Carter. So when I interviewed Volcker a couple of times, not long before he died, and I said, some people say that you elected and reelected Ronald Reagan. You elected him because he jacked up interest rates to 19% in 1980. Try getting reelected when you have 19% interest rates. And Volcker said, I've heard that, but one time I ran into Jimmy Carter at a fishing lodge in the 80s, and I said, I'm sorry if I helped cost you your presidency. And he put on one of his big smiles. Some of Carter's smiles were kind of fake, as even Brzezinski acknowledged. But this was a kind of a genuine smile. And he said, Paul, there were many factors. And I think that's accurate. There were many, he had a divided Democratic Party. Ted Kennedy challenged him
for the nomination in 1980.
He had problems with Billy Carter, an amusing figure who was, harmful to his campaign, and obviously the hostages and a terrible economy. So in some ways, he was overwhelmed, as you say. But the idea that he was weak on the Soviet Union is just completely wrong. And as I mentioned, if you talk to people like Havel and others, they believe that standing up for human rights, doing things like writing letters to Andrei Sakharov, the great Soviet dissident, and Natan Sharansky, and standing up, reversing some of Henry Kissinger's détente policy, was very helpful in weakening the Soviet Union. I don't think that his response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was very effective. He boycotted the 1980 Olympics, which at first was very popular, but turned out to be kind of a silly move that just hurt athletes and didn't accomplish anything. And even worse was the grain embargo that was imposed because the Soviets just bought grain from other countries. So these were inept responses to the Soviet invasion. But the conservatives didn't have any better responses. And in terms of undermining the Soviets in Afghanistan by supporting the Mujahideen, which most people think Ronald Reagan did, which is an extremely important part of winning the Cold War. Actually, the covert operations to aid the Mujahideen, to undermine the Soviet-backed regime in Kabul, they started under Jimmy Carter. So a lot of this history is more complicated than people think, and the kind of broad strokes don't work. Another thing you hear about Carter a lot is, he too much attention to detail. He didn't know how to manage. Well, if you look at Camp David or normalization with China, or even something like the Alaska Lands Bill, which doubled the size of the national Park Service. Talk about an accomplishment. All of them required Carter's intense focus on detail. And while I think he got bollocksed up with that when he was governor of Georgia, I don't really think it was a problem for him when he was president.
You mentioned the economy, and I just want to underscore this for the benefit of our audience. Yes, there has been a period of inflation in our country the last couple of years. It's aggravated people. It shows up in the polling data persistently. But it doesn't compare with the inflation of the 70s, the late 70s. There was an oil shock that drove fuel prices, gasoline prices, up by orders 3 or 4 orders of magnitude.
Correct.
Inflation was running at double digits. Interest rates were at double digits. We complain about interest rates around 7%, as Jonathan mentioned. Think about 18 or 19%. I mean, they're inconceivable to our economy now. And it did create a sense that Carter can't control these events. I'm so unhappy with this economy. So much worse than it is now, and it's bad. Politically, it's bad now. Those headwinds were astonishing.
Yeah.
In re-election.
Yeah, and until the last week, he was still in it. The polls showed him neck and neck, and they kind of, it became a blowout after their one and only debate. Reagan was such a thoroughbred candidate, as George Will called him at the time, and so much of a better communicator than Carter, who never really mastered television, that after that debate and after a failed final effort to negotiate the release of the hostages, the roof caved in on Carter.
And as I understand it from those close to former President Carter, that was the one great hope they had, that there would be a hostage breakthrough right before.
Yeah. And of course, and I write about this in the book, there's some real evidence. It's not slam dunk evidence, but there's very, very troubling evidence that William Casey, who later became Reagan's CIA director and at the time was his campaign manager, went to Madrid in the summer of 1980 and met with Iranians, and they agreed, basically Casey told them that they'd get a better deal if they waited until Reagan was president.
That's sort of an article of faith with the former president's inner circle, as I understand it, that Casey did that.
Yeah, there's some new things that have come out in recent years. For a long time, the debunkers of that theory made it seem as if there was no way that Casey was in Madrid. But about 10 years ago, with very little attention, new evidence came out establishing that he was in Madrid. Now, there's no document that we have, and the word of the Iranians about this, they say the deal happened, is not very useful. But
from a journalist or historian's perspective, do you have a verdict?
Yeah, I think I think it happened, but I can't prove it, and so to talk about it as historical fact would be inappropriate, I think, at this point.
Do you think the conversation deserves more attention than it's gotten and would amount to a campaign scandal of significance?
Would amount to a scandal in when?
Let's say a historical understanding of this. Like, this should be viewed with more alarm or more seriousness than it has been.
Well, Peter Baker had a story in the New York Times in 2023 that put another piece on this in this mosaic. It wasn't dispositive itself. Involved former Texas Governor John Connally, but it was another piece of evidence.
Gave voice to awareness and
traveling.
It helped
increase some awareness. My own sense is that even if the hostages had come home, even if the Iran hostage rescue mission, which was in April of 1980, had been successful, and as you remember, helicopters crashed in the desert. I still think Carter would have lost, but it would have been more narrow.
That is the voice of Jonathan Alter, his book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. We're talking about the former president. More when we come back. This is The Takeout.
He, time and again, do the right thing, even if it was politically damaging to him.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Jonathan Alter is our special guest. The book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. We are talking in great detail about the former president. Tell my audience, because as you know, podcasts tend to trend to younger listeners. They may have only heard these words, have no concept of what they mean. 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Carter and his unique, almost providential preparation for that moment and that crisis.
Yeah, well, 3 Mile Island is a nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, and Jimmy Carter had been in the nuclear Navy. He was involved in an important way in the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century, which was putting a nuclear power plant on the back of a submarine. And they weren't even done on land at that point to generate power. And Admiral Hyman Rickover, who Carter, with some reason, believed to be the greatest engineer who ever lived, got this done. Colin Powell said that it won the Cold War because changed the strategic balance, because we had nuclear-powered submarines and the Soviets did not. For many years, they couldn't make them safe enough. So he left when his father died. He went back and, had this career in business. He was an agribusinessman and
Famously a peanut farmer.
In a period of what you could only call white terrorism in the Jim Crow South after World War II, after Brown versus Board of Education. And in many ways, I think the most interesting parts of the book for me to research were that period when he was a young man back in Georgia. But he always maintained his scientific knowledge. And when 3 Mile Island happened, there was a near meltdown in 1979. He was perfectly positioned to understand how serious it was. And like so many other issues, he had a very nuanced view of nuclear power. He was okay with uranium-based reactors, which is what they're talking about bringing back now, and they're beginning to. But he canceled a plutonium breeder reactor project in Tennessee, which cost him Tennessee. Again, this is the kind of thing that Jimmy Carter would do. He would time and again do the right thing, even if it was politically damaging to him, even if his wife and mother were, say, telling him, bomb Iran.
Right.
He'd say, not going to do it.
Right.
Or put this off till the second term. Got to do it now because it's the right thing to do. Now, he would be very political in certain circumstances when he was running for office, but he thought there was a separation between governing and campaigning, and he applied that. And certainly, he didn't get more popular after
Right.
3 Mile Island.
To underscore the point, I've gotten to know Jack Watson, who was his last chief of staff, and he will remind anyone willing to listen that once the hostages were taken, President Carter vowed not to campaign until they were home.
Yeah, that was a terrible mistake on his part.
So just think about that, ladies and gentlemen. He would not campaign, do anything overtly political for his own re-election campaign. That's what you made reference to when you said he was sort of held hostage in his own right. Certainly the political side of the re-election was. And that was not only symbolically, but he thought substantively important to do and a signal to send, but injurious in many respects.
Well, it also, it started out as a bit of a political move because he had been way behind Ted Kennedy in the polls. And then on the same day, November 4th, 1979, the hostages were seized, and Ted Kennedy gave an interview to Roger Mudd in which he couldn't explain why he wanted to be president.
From a very famous television network, by the way.
Yeah, and I deal with all of that in the book. So the result was Carter's numbers shot up, and he crushed Kennedy in the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary with this rose garden strategy of not leaving, not campaigning. But it went on for too long,
Right.
and then Kennedy won these late primaries and took it all the way to the convention, which was very damaging to Carter. So the idea of allowing himself to be seen as caring too much about the hostages eventually hurt him, and I think would count as one of his mistakes.
Sketch out for my audience the Jimmy Carter character that you came to know. What are the characteristics about him that are most meaningful to you from a historical or journalistic evaluation?
Well, so first of all, he was the product of what can only be described as an epic American life. I argue that he was essentially the only president, maybe the only major figure who lived in 3 centuries. He was born in 1924, but it might as well have been the 19th century or earlier, because his family had no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. He was barefoot for most of the year. They weren't poor, but this is what things were like in southwest Georgia, where it was one step up from slavery for the black Georgians who worked for his father. And his father was a white supremacist. His mother was a nurse who took care of black patients for free. And he had a third parent, a woman named Rachel Clark, an illiterate farmhand who taught him his love of God and nature, which were extremely important parts of his character. And so he came up as this surrounded by not just bigotry, but, as I mentioned, white terrorism that was going on in this community.
Not too strong a word.
And he managed to stand up for black midshipmen at the Naval Academy. But then when he got home, after he left the Navy, he was a bystander to the Civil Rights Movement. He was never part of the Civil Rights Movement. And while he became close friends with Daddy King when he was president and Coretta King when he was governor and president, he never met Martin Luther King Jr. Because he was ducking.
Yep.
And in some ways using coded language to appeal to segregationists when he was running for governor in 1970. But then, having been elected governor, he then integrated Georgia state government, and he took the United States as president from tokenism to real diversity. With women as well, he appointed 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of his predecessors combined. And my basic take is that this is a man who spent the second half of his life making up for what he did not do in the first half, namely stand up for people. And so there's some atonement that's at work here in a man of great intelligence, great decency, but also a certain coldness on occasion, snappishness. You know, I'm one of those people who believes that even when somebody dies, you need to paint a complete picture of them.
Yep.
And he could be difficult. I asked his son Jeff at one point, if you could use one word to describe your father, what would it be? And he said, intense. And I think that is appropriate. He's not that warm, fuzzy, saintly guy
Hard to get close
you see on TV. No, I think I interviewed some people who you could describe as good friends, but even the people in that category, there was a reserve, and in this sense, he and Rosalind Carter, their marriage resembles that of Ronald and Nancy Reagan, something that both the Carters would not like, because there was really bad blood between them.
Between the two of them.
But
the
Reagans had this marriage that nobody else penetrated.
Right.
And the same was true of the Carters. They were married for 77 years.
77 years.
They'd known each other for 96 years because his mother took Jimmy, her toddler, around to see the new baby after she delivered Rosalind Smith.
Right.
And so
Stop you right there,
they
Jonathan.
were
Hold on
they
one
were in
second.
they were in a place that nobody else could penetrate.
The voice of Jonathan Alter. Our continued conversation about Jimmy Carter when we come back. This is The Takeout.
At one point, came upon a brothel. He tried to convert the madam. Didn't quite work.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Again, our thanks to the Lambs Club here in Midtown Manhattan. Our guest, Jonathan Alter. His book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. We are discussing former President Carter. I want you to talk to my audience about Jimmy Carter's faith, his born-again Christian conversion or revelation, and how that influenced his life, but also shaped the politics of that era in the sense that he identified with something that was happening in America at the time, this sort of sense of evangelical Christianism or the idea of being born again.
Yeah, so Carter was a Baptist, and he was raised in that tradition. He was always devout, but after he lost for governor in 1966, he felt at sea and spiritually, and he had some moments of doubt, and a couple of things happened in that 1967-68 period. His sister Ruth, who was a kind of a New Age evangelist, Billy Carter, when Jimmy Carter was first running for president, he had a funny line. Carter was at 0% in the polls, and Billy Carter, who ran a gas station in Plains, Georgia, and famously, had Billy Beer later, said, "I got a mother who went to the Peace Corps at age 68. I got one sister who rides with the Hells Angels. That's his sister Gloria. I got another sister who's a holy roller. My brother thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only normal one in the whole damn family." But his sister Ruth kind of helped bring him back to Christ. And it wasn't an overnight thing, his born-again experience, but it was taking place in that period. And he then, in 1968, he went as a Baptist missionary in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and he went door to door for Jesus for a few weeks. And at one point, came upon a brothel. He tried to convert the madam, didn't quite work. But faith was an enormously important part of his life, and he was arguably the most devout man ever to be president of the United States. But he was also, and this goes back to the original Baptist tradition, to Roger Williams. The Baptist tradition in the United States was founded in part on the separation of church and state.
Yep.
And so Carter was a very strong believer in this. He made sure that it got into the Georgia State Constitution when he was in the Georgia State Senate. And he was careful about that. But he fell out with the evangelical right, which was ascendant around the time he was president. And people like Jerry Falwell ended up supporting Ronald Reagan, who, barely went to church. And we've seen this accelerate in the years since. I mean, they embrace Donald Trump, although he's clearly not a devout person at all. Carter had been, very active Baptist, but he ended up, after leaving the presidency, resigning from the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest religious organization in the United States, over its treatment of women. and its insistence on intruding into politics. So there was an uneasy relationship he had, and after he was not able to integrate his church in Plains, when Friends started a new church, integrated. So these issues of faith and race were intertwined in his life as well.
There are those who are fans of the Carter presidency who like to talk about its deregulatory fervor. That is to say, he deregulated things, and people think Reagan deregulated a bunch of things. Actually, if I have this history correct, Carter did.
Yeah, it was a very important part of his domestic program. A lot of it he did in collaboration with Ted Kennedy, who of course became his arch rival inside the Democratic Party. And Ted Kennedy had an aide named Stephen Breyer who worked with the Carter White House on these things. They didn't do anything to deregulate health and safety, which Reagan did. So they strengthened the FDA, for instance. They didn't deregulate Wall Street as Bill Clinton did. But they did deregulate the airline industry. At the time, it cost in current dollars about $1,400 to fly from New York to Los Angeles. So, and if you think of all of the people who have been able to go see a sick relative or visit their grandchildren, because airfares came down so much under Jimmy Carter.
Because competition was opened up.
Yeah. Now, in some cases, on some routes, fares went up, but overall they went down. And trucking deregulation was enormously important. The just-in-time delivery system that we have is one of the foundations of our economy, and makes,
our globalized
Amazon,
e-commerce economy
Yeah,
possible.
It used to be that there were these kind of ridiculous regulations of trucking. And it went on a lot beyond that. Just to give one more quick example, there were these ludicrous regulations of the brewing industry that went back to the 1930s, and Carter got rid of them, and that allowed the development of craft breweries. I don't think there are too many people who, when they have their craft beer, they toast Jimmy Carter, but
they ought to.
Maybe they should.
We have about a minute and a half. And in the Takeout, Outtake Especial, we'll talk about Jimmy Carter's post-presidency, which gets a lot of attention. Anything else about his presidency that you want to underscore, Jonathan Alter?
Well, I think the environmental record is really important. And people, I think, know that he put solar panels on the roof of the White House that Ronald Reagan took down. That was symbolic. There was a lot of achievement behind that. And one of the things that happened was he got a very bad press. He didn't have, as his press secretary said, we not only didn't have a honeymoon, we didn't even have a one-night stand with the press. And so the press ignored a lot of important bills that did things like allowed utilities to use clean energy. Slight detail, right?
Right.
These are very consequential things. And he was also the first president who raised the problem of global warming, although because he wasn't reelected, he wasn't able to do anything.
And we didn't even
about
call it that then, right? But it was just the idea of the...
Yeah, yes. And so right at the very end of his presidency, his White House issued reports on the problem of global warming with some possible solutions. But because he had lost, he wasn't able to implement any of them. But there were many energy and environmental bills. Of course, he established the Department of Energy and the Department of Education, but I think those are often overstressed. The other accomplishments were more significant.
That is the voice of Jonathan Alter, his book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. That concludes this episode of The Takeout. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial.
The main thing is he set a new standard which most former presidents tried to meet.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett. Jonathan Alter is our special guest. His book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, as we're talking about the former president, here at the Lambs Club, Midtown Manhattan. We thank them for their hospitality. So the post-presidency of Jimmy Carter gets very successful post-presidency. I think you could make a historical argument. John Quincy Adams, Jimmy Carter, most important post-presidency, but Carter's right up there.
Oh, absolutely. First he reinvented the vice presidency by giving his vice president, Walter Mondale, things to do.
Real
which
job.
had never been done before. Then he reinvented the position of first lady by having Rosalind be one of his top advisors, far beyond Hillary Clinton or Eleanor Roosevelt.
Unapologetically and unabashedly.
And she was a very formidable person who was, her advice was good most of the time. And then he reinvented the post-presidency. Former presidents don't have power, so he didn't get as much done as a former president as he did as president. But he has, at the time of his death, the Carter Center had come very close to eradicating guinea worm disease, which afflicted more than 3 million people. Now I think there are under 25 cases in the whole world. Similar progress on river blindness. He and the Carter Center introduced this idea of monitoring elections. They went to more than 100 countries to try to make sure the elections were on the up and up. And then he also brought peace, prevented wars in Haiti and North Korea in 1994, got a number of political prisoners out. So there were major accomplishments when he was a former president. But the main thing is he set a new standard, which most former presidents, not Donald Trump, but most of the others who succeeded him tried to meet. He also made some mistakes as a former president. He too often acted like a kind of freelance Secretary of State, which annoyed his successors. Understandably. But on balance, he made an immense contribution and became a global icon, a global humanitarian. Now, people say, well, how about Habitat for Humanity? I spent a week building a house with them in Memphis, and this was also very important, and he chaired the board, and he and Mrs. Carter built a house every year, and he put them on the map. They're now the largest builder of nonprofit housing in the world. But that was not actually done by the Carter Center. He never actually ran, and he didn't start Habitat for Humanity. But the achievements after leaving office are mostly, I think, most important in providing inspiration for people to do things for other people. We talked earlier about his faith. In some ways, I think it's the Methodist credo. Rosalind Carter was born a Methodist that fits Jimmy Carter best, even though he was a lifelong Baptist. And that's to do as much as you can for as many as you can for as long as you can. And Jimmy Carter lived that idea. And I think in today's world, that sense of decency and commitment to helping others lead better lives is an inspiration.
The voice of Jonathan Alter. We thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. Thanks, Major.
We'll see you next week, folks.